Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Haas Talks Foss. I'm the Haas, Matt Yankovic, head of open source strategy here at Percona. And today I'm joined by Avi Press, the CEO of Scarf. Avi, how you doing today?
Doing great. Excited to be here.
Great to hear. Now, Avi, I'm passionate about open source, and I have had lots of conversations around measuring open source, and I know Scarf is designed to help measure, the impact of your projects and what's happening in the open source space. But before we get there, I wanted to talk to you and ask you about you. Where did you start your career, and how did you get involved in open source?
Yeah, so my career background is in software engineering. And I would say I got into open source kind of from two different sides. One of them, just being a developer, all the tools that I was using, just, up and down the stack is open source, and just get very involved with it that way. My first programming job, I worked at Pandora right out of school and was using a lot of open source there, and really got to deal with a lot more of the open source community just by way of depending on these tools in an industrial setting, needing to work through bugs as they pop up in our dependencies. But down the road, I think I really more got the experience from the maintainer side of things when I was just building tools for myself for fun or for work or whatever, and just putting them out there. If they were useful to me, maybe they'd be useful to other people, and just kind of put stuff online. And as some of the projects picked up steam and people came for contributions or questions or whatever it might have been, just continued to kind of walk down the path of an open source maintainer. And that's really what got me so hooked on the experience of being in open source. Of just, wow, someone from Brazil or Finland or Nigeria contributing to the project. That's such it's a really incredible thing to see a project take off like that.
And you really didn't start off as a maintainer then. So you started off as that user, that end user who is, appreciating using, and you're like, hey, I want to develop something to work on. Might as well throw it out there as open source. And people just started using it.
Pretty much. I think I got lucky a couple times with Hacker News of just like, just put it on, throw it up there. And then sometimes you get that little shotgun blast of PR for the project. And, often that just goes away and dissipates in, 24 hours. But some people stick around. And that's when you get kind of the semblance of whatever early kind of community you're going to build.
Yeah. If you could go viral on Hacker News, people love it, right? Like, so you get a big bump, like I've gotten 30, 40,000 views, just from one Hacker News on the front page. Right. And it can really boost things. Now, as you were this maintainer, you were starting to look at these projects and people started to contribute and started to work with you, started to download, started to use. From what I understand, you found that there was a deficiency in understanding your users.
Absolutely.
And maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my projects were distributed. So, code being on GitHub, and the artifacts I was distributing either on the package registries of the language I was using, which was largely Haskell, so package being the main registry, or via Docker containers on Docker Hub. All I really knew about the impact of my project was, well, here's how many downloads I have. And here's how many pissed off people are opening up issues on GitHub about something that I broke for them. And all the lovely people that were contributing. And that's basically all I had to work with. But anytime people would come in with, some issue or complaint, and that person complaining was at a big company, it's a pretty stressful situation to be in as a maintainer. You want your project to look good. You want to look good in the space. And so over time, that increased maintenance burden was kind of the thing that was, someone says, hey, this doesn't work on this breaks on Windows. And I wonder, well, how many people are actually using this on Windows? Like, should I actually prioritize this or not? Or should I just say, I hope someone comes in and fixes it, because I don't have I'm not on a Windows machine, or I wasn't at the time. I'm still not. And so metrics were kind of failing me, both from a just doing my work as a maintainer perspective, but also the perspective of, well, if I'm providing value to people at big businesses, should I start a company around these tools? maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but I didn't have any data to help actually answer that question.
And that's how Scarf was born, is a way to measure the impact for your projects. Because let's be honest, necessity is the father of all innovation, as they say. And so, having the pain of understanding how you could maintain these projects better, you started to look at ways to collect additional metrics and find out more data on who's using and how it's being used in the wild.
That's exactly right. At the time, a lot of the tools I was putting out there were like command line utilities of one form or another, and it seemed kind of weird to, for instance, stand up like a backend just so I could collect metrics from those CLIs, for instance. But the distribution channels I was using to get this stuff out there just wasn't helping at all. And when I thought about, okay, well, like if I did, connect with, say, a commercial user, like what would I even do? Like, what would I sell to them if I was trying to build a business? I could try to broker a support contract. Maybe I could try to change the license structure and sell them access to additional features. But if I did, how would I give them those new features? Like I would have to just do all of the gating inside the CLI application. Like, do I really want to start like putting Stripe integrations into a command line app? Like that's crazy. And so it really became a front of mind problem of like, how do I get better data out of distribution channels, and how do I have distribution of my software that actually is amenable to the kinds of things that I would like to do? And so those ideas are really what got Scarf started. I put out a blog post with these two pieces in mind, like the analytics and then the like commercialization of the distribution channels. And that blog post is what kind of took off more than other things I put online. And that's what told me that, oh yeah, there's actually a lot of other developers that are struggling with these things as well. And there might actually be something that I could do to address it.
What exactly is Scarf? Like people haven't experienced it. So we've been talking a little bit about the metrics, your journey, and it's a really interesting story. Because I think it's a very common story, right? You start off, using open source, you build some tools to help you out. People start to use them. They start to get popular. You have no idea who's using them or how they're using them. They're asking you for help. Right. And you're like, I don't know if I should do this or not. I don't know how to handle this. And then that leads you to creating Scarf, which most people don't create Scarf. You're the only one. So it's proprietary to you. But, so that's where the story deviates. But it's a very common story. So you built Scarf to solve these problems. What is it? Tell us what it is.
Yeah, Scarf has definitely evolved since I first started working on it, but what it has turned into is a set of tools to aid with open source distribution, analytics, and then downstream for that, commercialization. So we build tools that help you understand, how are people downloading the software? Where in the world are our users? What companies do they work at? What versions are in use, all these kinds of things that are really commonplace kind of metrics in other domains of software, but not in open source. And so we're trying to really make it so that if you are an open source project, company, maintainer, you can understand the impact of your work. You know what companies rely on it. You can connect with those companies and you can build a business around your tools, or you just understand, what is the impact of what you are doing in the open source space and better understand that. And so, whatever your goals are, they will probably be aided by being informed and being able to make data-driven decisions. And that's that is the foundation of what we're building. So it's a suite of tools that all fit together. We'll give you different pieces of the story here, so you can kind of understand the journey that your users are going through when it comes to your open source. Like, how do they discover it? How do they use it? Where are they getting stuck? How are they engaging?
Okay. And that suite of tools, obviously the two that are really out there now, one is geared towards measuring who's accessing and using your documentation. The other's on the Scarf gateway, which I understand is just it's basically a proxy server that collects data. It's a gateway that allows you to see who's coming in and asking for, right now downloads or packages, but it could be anything really. It's whatever you want to measure, right?
That's exactly right. It very similar to how Bitly works for URL shortening. We've kind of taken that idea and applied it more for the open source space. So you can put packages behind it, containers behind it, arbitrary URLs and files behind it. People put their whole websites behind it, and it's just kind of a way to put up some very, very easily put up some analytics in front of whatever it is that you distribute. But then also making them available all from one place. So you can be distributing, files from GitHub releases, executables on S3 and Docker Hub containers, all from the same endpoint, and it just kind of just works for all the whatever package managers you might be pulling that down from.
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting is you aren't just relying on download stats. And in my experience, a lot of projects, they start early on focused on downloads. That's how they get their funding. That's how they, prove their growth, their adoption, right? I got 1 million downloads. But oftentimes when you talk download numbers, those are often skewed or unreliable.
That is exactly right. I think this is more common than we would like to admit in the open source space, that you may have 1 million downloads a month, but realize that 95% of them come from 2 people that just have a CI pipeline that is pulling all the time. And we see this, like that is not a made up scenario at all. That is very real. I think from building a business and raising money from institutional investors or whatever that might look like, it's very different to say, we have 1,000 downloads from one person, or 1,000 downloads from 100 people, or 150 businesses. These are all very different contexts, and they have very different implications for what opportunity you have in front of you. And making that more available in open source more generally just means that we can have maintainers that are making better decisions in general, and maintaining their software more effectively and more proactively, I think would be another very underrated aspect of this, because my personal experience as a maintainer, it often just felt like you're just drowning under the issues and bugs and these kinds of things, never really getting out from under it, because you only really know something when someone comes and tells you, which by then, in a lot of circumstances, is already too late.
Yeah, and I think that as we start to invest more in the open source space as a society, and as we see more of these projects come along, the need for more analytics on what's happening is just growing in this space. Now I'm really curious. You have users who are using Scarf to collect metrics and collect data on their packages. Where are you seeing any trends or seeing anything in that? Like, it used to be, like I said, people distributed through Yum repos, or your classic Linux repos, and it's evolved, right? So now you've got Python has their own repos, and you can get repos for Ruby, and you can get repos for everything else, and we're seeing Docker containers. So from a packaging perspective, how are people releasing their software nowadays? Is it changing?
Yeah, it's a good question. In terms of how things are getting released, I mean, I think in some ways these things are getting a little bit more decentralized in some sense, that you do want to start pushing artifacts to different places depending on use cases. The Linux world is a really great example, because you have to basically manage, am I going to be in kind of the mainline, apt in Yum, or do I want to self-host these repositories, or what do we want to do? And in practice, you might want to do multiple things. And in the container world, there's been a lot of similar discussion here where everyone was pushing a Docker Hub for a long time. And then suddenly they say, actually, we're going to start rate limiting anonymous accounts from how much they can pull from us, effectively gating access to other people's work. Putting a paywall in front of other people's work and cutting the creators of that work out of the equation entirely. And so you have a lot of people that then want to switch to GitHub or switch to Google or these other things, but there's that lock-in effect as well. So yeah, I think the overall trend with publishing that I would say is changing over time, and we see changing, is just a desire for more control over the distribution channel. So it should be something that serve from your own domain, not from someone else's domain, because they can unilaterally make these changes to your distribution that you have no control over, which is a increasingly problematic situation, I think.
So that's an interesting shift, right? Because if you are coming, kind of full circle, because I mean, like early days before, we had repositories, everything was self-hosted. So you're seeing kind of that reversal where now we're saying like, okay, we were hosting on X, but now we're going to host, on our own. You think that's driven because there are so many places that you could go get software and it's just difficult to deploy to all of them?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that's certainly part of it. I know that we see a lot of companies that are specifically with Linux packaging of like, there's so many places we need to push this to that it's easier to just push it here. And then we can let the repository maintainers at, Debian or wherever do their own thing with this. And, I think that there's those pros and cons to that model, I think. But ultimately, I think it's kind of it's on you to distribute. If you want to have any say in how these things are distributed, you will ultimately need to do some of it yourself or have some kind of policy on what you do here. And I think over time we are also seeing improvements in the observability of these things over time. So like the Python being a lot better, like a lot of data that you can get out of the PyPI and these kinds of registries. Same with like Rust with crates.io and these other sources that are giving a little bit better insight here as there's more choice for what you can do. Yeah, honestly, I think the choice aspect of this is really big. That just we don't get locked into the single platform of the day. We can go to multiple places, which is also really important for service continuity. What happens when one of these registries goes down? What do you do? Like people are just offline for a while. Development flows stop while CI is crashing and these kinds of things. So I think rambling to get towards an answer to this, but yeah, I think that's one of the big shifts that we are seeing is kind of more ownership being taken over distribution.
And, I think that, how Scarf works, from what I understand, is it provides a gateway, almost like a bit.ly, right? Like, so you have a URL and it basically, passes through that channel, and then it can ultimately go to any of the repositories behind the scenes. But because you have that gateway, you control some of the data that's being collected and how often it's being referenced. So if you're going to go and pull out of, Docker Hub, for instance, you would then put the gateway in front, which would then allow you to collect more data that you might have to pay Docker to get access to on their side, but it's only going to show you a portion of what that those downloads are, because you odds are you might have multiple places where you're hosted. So how do you aggregate them into one? And I think that's another interesting thing. I've been a big proponent of figuring out how to measure the effectiveness of open source for a while. And, I view this as you mentioned the pipeline earlier. I really view this as, as you start out, you're looking at those, like who's curious about your product. And I know you have a documentation, product as well to say like, oh, we'll check, who's accessing the documentation. But then it's like, okay, once you've checked that, then it's try it out. And then that's the download phase. Right. And so, if you look at who's accessing the website, who's accessing my documentation, who is downloading, and then, moving down to who is re-downloading and using it again in a month or 2 months or 3 months. That's a really interesting, way to view the data. But I'm curious, there's also this kind of negative connotation around like collecting data now, especially in, with GDPR in Europe and, PII. So what are you doing to, prevent collecting too much data, or, keeping people's data safe?
That's a very good question, because it's not easy to do all of this stuff and still be compliant with things like GDPR. And so one of the things that our system does, so our users don't have to do it, is that once we process metadata for an IP address, like what country did this come from, or what company was associated with a given download or view or whatever, we then go delete that information from our system. So we're not actually holding on to these raw IP addresses, or PII in the event that Scarf were to get hacked or something. And so, we're not sending those IPs out to our users because we don't have them to give them, which I think solves a lot of these problems. Ultimately, that's on us to make sure that we're very rigidly doing that, and there's not bugs that can potentially leak that information anywhere. But by doing that work and making that available to people, that ends up kind of securing a lot of these things. And one of the aspects of this conversation that I feel like is not often talked about enough is that we're always talking about, oh, well, what about the PII that's associated with what Scarf is collecting? But all the existing registries also collect this stuff today. They just don't use it, and they just don't give the maintainers access to it. But that doesn't mean it's not being collected. It doesn't mean that if someone were to, hack one of these registries tomorrow, that a bunch of PII wouldn't be leaking about exactly who was using what. We just don't confront the fact that this data is being collected or make use of it. And so I think this is something that really applies to a lot about open source and privacy and economics, is that these incentives are there. We're just kind of keeping a blind eye to it. And we really would benefit from being much more explicit about what's in play here.
Yeah. So really what you're saying is you're just taking the data that is not being used, but is available, and using it.
Depending on what you mean by available here, but yeah, it's available to Docker, it's available to NPM, and so yes, exactly right.
So it's really about freeing, the data that other people are already collecting on your users.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and so I think
that's an interesting angle, right? Because, from I've got users using my product all around the world, and, all these other companies, all these other, projects know about them. They might not do anything with it, but they can get access. They can do all this stuff with it. I can't.
Right. And if anyone is going to have that data, the maintainers, I think most people would agree, would be the one group of people that should really have it. And so one of the things that we learned really early on, though, is that it's not really just about what data is being collected that people are sensitive to. It's also how it is collected. And so one of the things that we tried early was we made a JavaScript library that would just it basically had a post-installation hook that would send these statistics up to Scarf. The exact same stuff that NPM would collect from there, as the way that their terms of service define. But people really didn't like it, because we were basically inserting analytics and phone home mechanisms in a place where it didn't exist before. And so we got a lot of pushback on that from the end users of the maintainers that were using Scarf. And so the way that we've approached this with Scarf Gateway has proved to be a lot better, because it doesn't involve any code instrumentation. It's kind of just part of the normal path, and no additional hooks are being added, which seems to be very important to people. Although I think ultimately we should probably care more about the data being collected, but nevertheless, here we are. So we got to just do what people people want.
Telemetry is often a challenge, right? And I mean, unfortunately, you can't build a solid product, continue to grow without understanding who and how your stuff is being used.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about who from an individual, right? So, and this is where there's a fine line, knowing that, 30 people from this kind of basic demographic use a product in a certain way is different than knowing Avi uses it this way. Right. And I think that, there's a fine line between those two, but the pushback often gets pushed back on both when really it's more about the individual, right? Like preventing the individual's data. And it is an interesting thing because we've seen this in the past several years where people have tried to move more towards the telemetry and gotten just, slapped down because of it. Because people don't want to potentially be tracked, even though they're already being tracked.
Right. Yeah. It's a real tough thing. I think we just haven't really accepted how much this is already these wheels have been in motion for a long time. And now that there's explicit discussion of it, there's more hesitation around it. But ultimately, because it's there, it's really it's not a question of should we collect it. It's a question of who should have access to it. And that's I think the crux of the issue here.
So, Avi, I'd like to, go through a rapid fire round of questions.
All right.
These are completely random. I have no idea what I'm going to ask. So,
cool.
So it might be scary, but it's okay. We'll get through it.
All right.
We'll get through it.
I'm ready.
All right. So Avi, what was the first programming language you used?
Scheme in college. I loved it.
Scheme.
Absolutely loved it. Yeah, Scheme. Yeah.
I don't even know if I've heard of Scheme. What is Scheme?
Oh, Scheme it's a flavor of Lisp.
Okay.
A particular flavor of Lisp. Yeah. So I was in college. Yeah.
I was like, what? I hadn't heard of that. I mean, I guess it dates me a little bit. Maybe I just missed that one. So if you're going to sit down today and hack out some code, what are you going to write it in?
I will. It depends on what I'm building, but my tool of choice these days is typically Haskell. I really love coding in Haskell, and Scarf is largely built in it.
And why Haskell?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of objective benefits that I would point to, but ultimately just because it's what I enjoy coding in the most. But why I enjoy it the most is because I really enjoy languages that have a huge emphasis on the type system and on static verification that the program does what I think it does when I write the code. And so Haskell, I think, is a joy to code in because it's the only language where you can sit down, write something very complex, fight with the compiler for an hour, and then once it compiles, it might just work. Without ever having the first time you actually can execute the program, very good chance it does what you think it does. It's not to say it's a perfect system or anything, but I think that experience of wrestling with the compiler to really explicitly code what I have in my brain and have it just run is a very particular kind of joy that I really, really like.
Okay, well, fair enough. Most used application on your desktop?
Ooh. I mean, I assume we're not including browsers here.
It could be a browser. It doesn't matter.
It's probably Chrome then, but I think a more interesting one. I do live in Emacs all day, even as even when I'm not writing code anymore, because all of my notes and to-dos, and I use org mode very extensively. And so
I don't like Emacs. I'm a VI
That's
guy.
fair. If it matters, I use Spacemac, so I'm using Vim bindings within Emacs. I don't know if that changes things for you at all.
No, it's one of those things, right? It's okay. I won't hold it against you.
That's fine. I appreciate that.
And so if you are going to go to a conference, meet up with someone, and you're all going to go out to dinner, what are you going to order 9 times out of 10?
Oh, just a generic, any kind of restaurant.
Generic, anything you just go. What's your favorite food? What are you going to look for first?
Any kind of noodle dish I really enjoy, like pasta, noodles, anything like that. I'm a big fan. Big carb guy.
Fair enough. Oh, carbs. Yes. Yeah. You're not doing the keto diet then, so that's
I am
okay.
not. No, I am not.
Okay,
not for now,
enough.
anyway.
And last book you read?
The last book I read, oh, that's a good. I don't read nearly as many books as I ought to these days. But the last book that I read was Norwegian Wood. I read recently, which I really enjoyed.
Okay, I'm not familiar with it. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah. I think I don't actually read fiction all that often, but it did happen recently that a fiction book was recommended, and so I read it. Yeah, I would highly recommend.
Yeah, if you weren't doing Scarf, what would you be doing?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd probably still just be, I'd probably be an engineer at a startup around in the Bay Area. I don't know exactly what, but that's what I was doing before. But if I wasn't doing technology,
take the tech out. What would you be doing?
Fair enough. Perhaps. I almost became. I was on track to in college. I was on a pre-med route, and before I kind of really fell in love with programming, like really just went off the deep end with coding. So I probably would have been a doctor.
Wow. Okay.
But yeah, these days I got very. I really love baking as well, and so maybe some version of me would have been a baker.
Well, there you go. What are you baking lately? Like, is it cookies, bread? What are you baking?
I bake a lot of bread, or not so much these days with Scarf. Really kind of put a wrench into a lot of that. But I really love baking bread and bagels and just any kind of anything related to that, like savory breads. I'm really into. Yeah.
So it fits with the carb theme.
It fits with the carb theme. Yeah, that didn't come from nowhere.
But hey, everybody who's listening in, if you do have a project, you're looking to get some additional metrics on who's using how the project being used out in the wild, check out Scarf. It's free. You can sign up. You can start using it today, get some additional metrics, and let Avi know if you have some feedback. I'm sure him and the team would really appreciate the help.
Feedback is always extremely welcome, and we will send you a scarf if you do.
Oh, wait a minute. That's what you send out as scarves?
We sometimes will send out scarves. They are our favorite company swag that we have.
Okay, so but I have to ask: is it like one of those Doctor Who scarves with like the 12-foot, like rainbow? Because those are awesome.
It's not, but we are going to be making some new ones soon, so I will take that as some feedback for what the next one should look like.
So if you want to be geeky, go for the Doctor Who scarf. Just saying.
Noted. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. All right. Avi, thanks for coming out today, chatting with me for a little bit, sharing with us about Scarf, about download metrics, and a few other things. So I do appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
All right. And people who are watching, go ahead and feel free to subscribe. Tell us what you'd like to hear from or who from next. And if you have questions for Avi, just leave them in the comments and we'll make sure he gets them. Until next time, everyone, thanks a bunch. Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.